They had brought torches from the livery and lanterns from the hotel. They filled the center of Maine with a ring of light, and in that circle, the town decided what they would do to a woman who had come from away. Dogs pressed their noses to the cold earth, and children were held at arm's length by men whose hands would tremble later. Reverend Mills kept his hat low. Judge Bradley avoided the full face of the thing he'd helped to set in motion, and Harold Morrison, banker, ledger keeper, and the man who smelled of money, stood with his coat collar up, looking smaller than his debts. Clara Whitmore stood beneath the torchlight with a child in her arms, wrapped in a shawl that had once been gentility and was now wet with the night's frost. The baby's tiny face was sharp and real and impossible to fold into the town's tidy stories. Someone had said the child's skin was not like theirs, and that whisper had slid through Main Street like poison. Accusation rarely needed more than a rumor to become ordinance. An ember flew past and landed on a straw cap. A man in the crowd spat and said, "A city woman brings trouble. The law must be plain." Someone else muttered a name he had no right to say. The crowd leaned inward as if their own weight could push a verdict. Beside her, Sophie, small, fierce Sophie, with the same quick jaw as her father, stood with a hand against Clara's sleeve, a quiet anchor. They came for an answer that could not abide complexity. They wanted a simple culprit in a simple execution. They had decided she must hang for the color of her child's skin. The question of ownership, of who bound the debt that pushed the land into another man's hands, who had set this household in place of a family, who had fed suspicion with cheap sermons, did not interest them. They wanted punishment, not truth. A shadow fell along Main Street, and a slow set of footsteps marked a figure who had remained outside the town's tidy condemnations. Ethan Walker. He had not wanted to be a leader. Loss had taught him the cost of too much attention. But he had what men in the valley respected, a hand that could steady a plow, eyes that had learned the lay of a canyon, and the kind of quiet people trusted when danger leaned close. He did a thing simple as bread. He put his shoulder between the ring of torches and the woman with the baby. He did not shout. He did not wave his arms. He set his hat on his head and went to the edge of the light, and with a motion as old as the Great Divide, he shouldered a gun. It was a long, honest piece of iron, kept oiled for winter and used for wolves and fences and the occasional mad dog. He did not raise it to kill. He did not point it towards a single man. He only showed the town he would make his stand. The gun's presence changed the geometry of the crowd. Voices dropped. Torch flames trembled nearer their lantern light. They called that moment courage.
Clara called it something else later. A man offering the last thing he could to a woman who had come to this place because the world had no place for her. It would be a story told in many tongues, as warning and as blessing. But for the night, it bought them time, and time would be everything. Months before the ring of torches, the meeting of hands, and the planning of ropes, Clara Whitmore stepped off a stagecoach onto a landing of packed earth and wind and the smell of horses. She came not as an adventurer, but as a woman who had been punished by a city for a rumor that had looked like betrayal. Boston had been gone from her for 2 years, and with it the sharp lace collars and the names that once rolled off tongues in polite rooms. She had crossed the country because Edgar Whitmore, her father, had made her leave his house, because scandal, real or invented, made other people's blood run colder than a winter's creek, and because a man with ledgers could turn a family's ruin into property. Her trunks were fewer than they should have been, and what remained in them glittered less than the life she had been taught to expect. Still, she carried a small, stubborn kind of education. In Boston, she had been taught to read a ledger and to steady a pulse. She could mend what was broken in linen and what was broken in law. Those skills were not polite conversation in a frontier town, but they would prove themselves valuable in ways that polite conversation never could. The contract that bound her to the Double W, Ethan Walker's claim, was the sort of thing built out of necessity. Harold Morrison had sat behind his wide desk and talked in the tone of men who owned the weight of a town's appointments and fortunes. "We can do this properly," he had said, showing Ethan the papers, "and you can keep the place in your name. Or we can let it go and the bank takes it outright." The bank had its manners. The bank had its interest. When the legalities bent like saplings in a storm, a marriage could be the rope that held a house together. The ceremony was a parish quick thing, the kind where vows are said beneath a roof more out of convenience than real consent. Reverend Mills, with his pipe smoke and habit of nodding towards sermons that smoothed over sin for a price, read from a worn book and watched Clara's face as if he expected her confession at the altar. Judge Bradley sat on the front pew, notched and careful, and the courthouse bells kept a beat that slowed Clarera's breath. Ethan said his vows because he had been told they would keep the land safe. Clara said hers because exile had made a woman willing to accept any anchor. There was no bridal bouquet, no songs. The ring the judge slid onto Clarera's finger caught the lamplight and showed a tiny nick where someone had sharpened it once. They went back to the Double W with people watching, and for months the arrangement was one of rooms partitioned by common decency. They slept apart.
They shared a table more in obligation than interest. They addressed each other with the careful politeness of strangers who knew the word of the law mattered more than the pulse of the heart. Sophie was the only person who could unbind the contract by mere presence. She was Ethan's daughter before the forced vows. She had the short hair of girls who'd learned to climb fences and a face that could change from suspicion to a smile without warning. At first, she kept Clara at arm's length. The child could not help seeing what the grown-ups refused to say, that this woman had been sent to them rather than welcomed. Yet Clara, who had known cold rooms and colder gossip, knew children in a way city men did not. She read Sophie books by lamplight and taught the girl a kind of arithmetic that belonged to the ledger and to the world. She showed Sophie how to hold a pistol safely, not as an instrument of war, but as a tool, the way a farmer keeps his plow, and Sophie's hands learned to trust a steady grip. Days unfolded by chore and weather. Morning coffee was boiled over a cast pot with cracked enamel. The wood stove had a rumor of a crack in its belly and spat a dry kind of heat. Clara learned to mend harness leather and to pick the best loam for seed. She learned the names of which plants healed and which invited fever. She kept a small cabinet by her room where she shelved bandages and boiled strips of cloth. A small tin of laudanum slept in the back corner for the kind of pain that will not be reasoned with. But she also brought an orderliness that the Double-Double had lacked. Ledgers arrived in her hands like chiding friends. She found balances chalked on the wall where no one had checked them in years. She learned the rhythm of debts due and debts paid. In Boston, she had watched her father shift numbers until they read his confidence. Here, she saw those numbers laid bare in ink and desperation. There were small oddities at first, a payment that never reached its mark, a signature that favored one man's name over another's. Morrison, when asked, smiled the smile of men accustomed to being trusted. "You're city-born," he said once at the bank, leaning on the polished counter. "You can see things other folk miss. Keep to your lady's sewing, Miss Whitmore." Clara only smiled, but the smile did not leave her eyes. She saw, as any good observer would, that Morrison was a man who arranged the town like a hand arranging seeds in soil, a seed here for a favor, a seed there for a silence. She began to keep records of her own. She copied entries from the bank's tall books into a small leather-bound ledger she kept beneath her mattress. She would stay up reading by candlelight, fingers stained with ink and the faint perfume of lavender she had insisted on keeping in a stitched bag. The sound of the pen scratching became as intimate as a heartbeat. Ethan watched all this with a suspicion softened by need. He had been a good man before grief took him, a father who could talk to horses as if they held counsel. Loss had pulled him inward. He tended fences, repaired weather-beaten beams, and in the long winter watched smoke rising from neighbors' chimneys as if he could map out the life he no longer led. Clara's knowledge irked him at first. It seemed geometric and city-born, a thing that had no place in a saddle-sore life. But it mended more than ragged seams. It fixed accounts that had been drifting toward calamity. She found a payment owed to the Walker name that had never been recorded against the ranch's debt. She discovered a promissory note in a hand she had learned to recognize from her father's library, the same hand that wrote in thin lines when a man wished to conceal a thing. There were small reconciliations, a loaf of bread shared in the kitchen's low warmth, Sophie waking in the night after a bad dream and finding Clara there with a cup of broth. Hearts that had been locked by sorrow learned to pick at their own tumblers. Ethan began to speak in fragments about his late wife, about how the house felt fuller and less like a house of absences when Clara hummed at the stove. Clara found herself telling him about Boston in small pieces, the river that hissed beneath the wharves, the neighbors who brought each other pies and looked askance when one of them misstepped through a rumor. She did not ask pity. She wanted only the dignity of work, the chance to put things in order. But the ledger would not leave them in peace.
One afternoon, when rain had made the earth into a low, persistent bruise, Clara opened a package from the bank left in the hall. It was a stack of papers sealed with Morrison's particular attention to ceremony. "For your records," read a note in fine script. The seal was stamped, the ink still tacky in places. She took the papers up to her room, set them on the bed, and began to read. "Numbers will look at you until you make sense of them. They can be cruel in their frankness. They can also reveal the shape a man's ambitions have taken." Clara found a schedule of payments that did not square with her memory of the ranch's needs. There was a ledger note that renamed certain parcels, and one that listed a lien against a man named Walker in a way she had not seen before. There were terms that shifted like quicksand, interest added at months missed, fees tacked on as if absurdity could wear a man down into surrender. And in the margins, the thin, almost bored handwriting of Harold Morrison himself. Adjustment, fee, penalty, transfer. The discovery sat between her like a secret guest. She called Ethan to the bedroom and spread the papers on the bed. "Look," she said, and the single syllable hung there as if the room were listening. Ethan read with hands that had known rope and plow, and found his mouth tightening the way it did when he was angry and too tired to speak.
He had trusted a bank folded in gentleman's mannerisms. He had signed papers because he had been told doing so would keep the land. Now those papers laid out a map that might take the land anyway. "It can't be right," he said at last. His voice was the kind that did not rise into hysteria. It sat like a rock. "Morrison wouldn't." "Morrison will," Clara finished. "He arranges the town by the weight of his comforts. He has made a thing that eats away at us, but it is on paper. We can prove it." Ethan's jaw worked. He wanted to fling the pages into the fire, to take a gun and go to Morrison's office and make a wreck of it all. He looked to Clara and saw there steadiness he had not expected. He saw a woman who would not be content with letting a bank eat his name. He saw the first trace of a partner. "And what will you do?" he asked. She folded the papers slowly, like one might fold a letter that must be kept. She did not make promises she did not mean to keep. "We will follow where the ink leads," she said. "There are witnesses, names in other ledgers, notes of payments that belong to folks who've been too poor to notice they were being bled. I know a man who will help. He practiced in Boston before he took on claims out here, Sam Fletcher. If anyone can read a set of crooked books and make them tell the truth, it's him. He has stood in courtrooms with me in the past. He is not afraid of Morrison." Ethan's eyes flicked to the window, where rain carved the glass into rivers. "Where will he be?" "Denver, most likely," Clara said. "If he is still in practice, he will be there. If not, then we have to find someone who will." The plan took shape in the hours after the rain stopped. They would not be reckless. Clara would ride with Sophie to Denver if necessary. She would gather proof and come back. They would not make a show of confrontation where the town watched. They would gather testimony, affidavits, signatures, proof that Morrison had overreached beyond the law. There were faces in town that would not like such scrutiny. Harold Morrison, when crossed, slowed like a winter wind. Judge Bradley and Reverend Mills had reasons to prefer their arrangements and an inclination toward silence. There were men on town councils who had a share in silence, because silence, Madison had taught, sometimes held a place in keeping peace. But Clara had known scandal and exile. She had little to lose and much that needed righting. After she laid out the plan, Sophie climbed up on the bed and wrapped both small arms around Clara's waist. The child's head was heavy with sleep and hay dust. "Will they like you there?" Sophie asked, in the clear way a child asks of adults. Clara kissed her hair and smelled of lavender in the warm room. "I will try very hard," she said, "and if they do not, we will find those who will." They packed with economy.
Clara took a spare dress that was sensible, a small satchel with her ledger, and a box containing the bank papers. Sophie packed a woolen muffler and a favorite wooden top. Ethan helped lash the trunks to a cart, slow but efficient. The neighbors, Molly O'Brien, the housekeeper who had more kin in her fingers than in her papers, and Tom, the foreman who had been loyal to Ethan's late wife, watched with that particular kind of curiosity that a small town keeps. "Keep a weather eye," Molly said, tucking her shawl closer. Tom clapped Ethan on the shoulder. The look they exchanged meant, "Do not let a man swallow this place you helped build." Before Clara left, she stood at the door of the Double W and looked back into the room that had been a stranger's house and had become a place of small reconciliations. The lamplight carved warm shapes across the floor. A patchwork quilt lay folded on the chair. For the first time in months, she felt no shame about what had been done to her. Shame, she understood finally, had been no more than a story other people told to make themselves feel safer. As the wagon creaked away down the lane, Ethan watched until it crossed the rise and diminished into the turn of road. He returned to the house slower than he had left. In the kitchen, the wood stove hissed, and Stuart's clock ticked. He picked up the ledger Clara had left open on the table and read again, a man rereading what must be faced. The papers were a map. The map had a route that led past Denver and beyond, but it also had a name in a corner he did not want to see: Harold Morrison. In town, Harold heard the rumble of wagon wheels and the clack of boots, and smiled as men like him do when they believe the current will carry them along without question. He would not know, not yet, that a woman who had been told she was barren of usefulness had found a way to be more useful than rumor and more dangerous than any lie he could tell. If you want to follow Clara a little further, to see what ink and courage together might unbind, take a moment now to subscribe and let the story find you when the next chapter rides into view. The road to Denver was not an express lane. It was a tired ribbon that took travelers past hollows and cattle crossings, by low, wind-shaken farms and towns that made a living off the travelers' comforts. Clara kept her ledger on her knee and made notes as they rode. Names of people Morrison had given loans to, dates that did not match, a notation that a parcel of land had been misidentified in favor of one of his shell companies. She wrote with the same care she had once used to copy medical recipes in Boston. The pen scratched, and the wagon's steady rhythm became a metronome for the plan. They passed through trading towns where men drank bitter coffee and where railroad timetables were discussed like scripture. In the evenings, Clara lodged at inns and wrote letters that she would not send until she had proof.
Sophie slept on a narrow bed and woke with the dawn to watch the prairie unroll itself, a world that had not yet been cut to conform to anyone's ledger. In Denver, Clara found Sam Fletcher in a law office made of wood and pretension. He was older than she remembered, and there was a salt line of trouble at his temples that did not suit the man she once knew in Boston parlors. But he opened a book and read the handwriting like someone who could taste the ink's intent. "You look like you have been through the mill," Sam said, after a long time of consideration. He placed the bank papers on his desk and set a glass of something with a color like autumn on the wood. "Tell me everything." She told him, all of it, and he made a map out of her words and the ledger's ink. His face gathered the way a man's does when he knows the work that law requires. Long hours, hard language, and an inclination to upset the comfortable if the comfortable stands on the wrong side of fairness. He did not promise quick victories. He promised work and circuits and affidavits, and when necessary, the slow turning of courts. Back at the Double W, Ethan kept watch. He walked the boundary lines and inspected the fence posts, and he read Clara's ledger as if it were a thing that might be sick. He kept the gun in its place, not a thing of celebration, but of readiness. He thought of the cost if they failed, the land perhaps taken, the name perhaps consumed, the family perhaps scattered. Grief had taught him to measure risk. Love taught him to weigh it differently. Days would pass in this pattern, Clara tracing ink to names, Sam lining up testimonies, Ethan holding the ground and patching fences. The town's whispers would climb like smoke on a dry day, and in time something else would happen, a small, fierce thing that would light tinder under the town's spite. On a night when the moon hung like a pale coin, and the wind came down from the north with a clear taste of iron, Clara felt a stir in her body that had surprised her with its insistence. She had not expected children at all. Rumor and rumor's punishment had said as much of her. For months she had lived a life of quiet competence and small presumptions. Yet here was a new life, stubborn and insistent as a root in plowed ground. There were moments after that when the house seemed to lean toward her, curious. She bore the child with the same steady hands with which she had harvested a crop or mended a ledger. Men came and went, Molly bringing broth, Tom lending an extra blanket, and Sophie at her side, holding Clara's hand as if to anchor a ship. The birth, when it came, was not a theatrical miracle. It was a long, breath-heavy event kept by lamps and warm hands and the careful words of a midwife who had learned to move between the living and the dying with equal tenderness. Dr.
Whitmore's name lingered in Clara's thoughts, fatherly memory and an inheritance of skill, but did not come in any more than a letter from the past. The women who had come to help did the necessary work, pulling, pressing, soothing, and telling stories to chase away the thin thread of fear that could creep into a room. When the baby was washed and wrapped and signed into the quiet of the back room, Clara held him close. He was small and warm and neon with newness. Sophie peered over the edge of the bed and reached a tiny hand to the child's cheek. The town outside was still whirled away, and the house was a cove anonymous with relief. The infant's skin had a tone that did not match the town's neat categories. It was neither scandal nor a sign. It was only the fact of being flesh, warm and particular. But to some, in a town that liked its truth simple, difference made rumor hungry. The first whisper came as a moth flutters at a lamp, a neighbor who saw the child from a distance, a half-borrowed tale at the post, a sermon that turned the concept of difference into a metaphysical wrong. From a whisper, the town created an argument. From an argument, they formed a plan. Morrison found a way to shape that plan. He had the kinds of friends who could translate fear into a meeting and a meeting into a decision. Reverend Mills found a text to read in his Sunday sermon that sounded less like charity and more like indictment. Judge Bradley suggested the law would have to be made tidy if a family's honor was at question. Men who had lent money to the bank found a moral logic to the arguments that somehow put their own fears into a larger, righteous shape. Word reached Denver that things there were changing. Sam Fletcher wrote a letter with fingertips that shook not from age but from the speed of events. He told Clara what he could do and what he could not. He cautioned against provocation, and he advised recording names and gathering statements. He wrote of the marshal who might be persuaded if his office saw cause. He offered the law as an instrument that could cut a man like Morrison down to size if the evidence was sound. Clara read the letter by the window and watched Sophie asleep with the child tucked against her chest. The house seemed to hold its breath. She did not pretend that the coming fight would be clean. She knew towns had short memories, except when it came to making a spectacle of fear. She also knew she would not surrender the child because others had no imagination for what it meant to be different. Ethan watched the way Clara folded the paper. He had been the sort to trust fists and fences more than a lawyer's slow justice, but the ledger had shown him the shape of the danger. He had come to trust that there was a steadier kind of courage than raw force. That trust would be tested.
He would put a gun on the table more than once, but it would be Clara's pen and Sam's law that would do the unmaking of Morrison's plots, if they could get the town to see. They began to collect statements. They wrote letters to people who had once owed money and now had reason to fear what had been done to them. They rode out to other farms and made friends of those who had little to gain by quietness. Each signature they brought back from a distant porch was a small victory. Each name was a string in an unraveling skein. But pieces of the town would not be persuaded by paper. Fear has a kind of gravity. It pulls at those who want a simple world. Threads of rumor are not always easily displaced by ink. Men in the bar would talk with rough certainty. A woman in the market would shake her head and cross herself. Reverend Mills's sermons would carry a tone so thin you could see the shadow of Morrison himself behind it. Judge Bradley would smile and show how the law needed a tidy house to make its bed. The odor of hostility is readily manufactured. In a back room where the stove hummed a patient heat, Clara sat at night with a candle and read over the names she had gathered. The room smelled of boiled lins and the faint herb tang of the ointments she saved for those who had no other care. She taught Sophie to stitch initials into handkerchiefs and to counter the sums for what the town would lose if greed held sway. The first arson happened a few weeks after the baby's birth. A neighbor's shed burned in a small, cruel blaze that licked at hay and then was put out with buckets and prayer. Men's faces went a tone harder. Molly O'Brien said it was meant as mourning. Tom said it was likely an accidental match, but the way he said it carried a caveat. Clara, who had stitched 100 small wounds and read 100 small lies, smelled the acrid circle of intent. Ethan rode to the edge of town and watched smoke rise where the shed had been. He came back later and set his hand on the framed timbers and thought of those ledgers in Clara's hand. He thought of the man who had made the arrangements that had sent Clara to his house. He thought of how a town could be coaxed to the sharp edge of violence for the sake of what a banker desired.
The months thickened in this way. Paper, petition, whispers, a shed smoldering to the ground, a sermon more pointed than the last. Clara found her confidence in the quiet things, in the neatness of a signature, in the steadiness of a witness who would not be bought. She held the baby against her chest and felt that specific, stubborn life. She would not let it become the tale of a scapegoat. It was on a night where the west wind brought an edge of snow that a rider came barreling to the Double W. He had come from town with a face cut by worry. "They're meeting," he said in a breath. "Harold stirred them. He says the law's unclear."
He says, "The town must." Ethan's hand went to the table and closed over his gun for a moment he did not yet choose to use. He felt the thing settle in his gut, a knowing that this was not merely the fear of difference, but the stoking of a fire by a man who had much to lose. He looked at Clara and through her to the child asleep in Sophie's lap. She met his gaze like a steady flame. "Then we meet them with the law," she said, "and with proof, and with every neighbor who will stand up and speak the truth." This time, their small house was the map drawn on the ledger's margin. It would be where courage and patience tied themselves into action. It would also be where people would test the idea that a family could be more than a contract, and that a child's worth would not be determined by the stories of others. They marshaled evidence and signatures and watched how the town's face shifted like weather. The threat gathered in Main Street and would be upon them in time, but for now it was ink and whispers and the slow motion of lawyers moving into place. They had bought time, and in that valley, time was often as precious as a cow in drought. Clara went to bed that night with hand on Sophie's hair and a ledger under her pillow. She was not the woman who had left Boston ashamed and shunned. She had a new kind of clarity, that justice is work, and that courage is often the patient, quiet insistence that truth be seen. She would not be passive. She would not let fear write its own law. But storms do not always wait for people to be ready. The town was a tinderbox. A single spark could become a bonfire, and some men liked bonfires because they let them see who bowed and who stood. When the first men began to stir in the shadows, it would be Ethan's face in the torchlight and Clara's ledger in a satchel that decided whether words could trump the rope. Their next actions would have to be careful, precise, and rooted in a law that moved slower than fury. They had prepared, and yet nothing could truly prepare them for the moment when a town, hungry for certainty, decided it wanted to hang a woman for the color of her child's skin. The ledger had given them an argument, the law had promised them a path, but the human heart is easily frightened, and sometimes clever men will push that fear until a town forgets it has a conscience. On the morning Clara was to ride with Sam's letters in her satchel to collect more witnesses, a wagon came to the door with a heavy set of wheels and a driver who would not meet Ethan's eye. The next step the town took would be visible and sudden, and the kind of thing that required more than paper and testimony. It would require a stand. Ethan watched the wagon and felt the slow tightening of a thing that might break. Inside the house, Clara smoothed Sophie's hair and tied a ribbon with hands that were steady as a stitch. The baby slept like a thing that did not know itself yet, warm and anonymous in the world's grand schemes. They had set their course. They had ink and law and courage. Beyond the window, the town gathered like a rumor already at the height of belief. The next movement would be the town's. The question was whether the law and the stubbornness of a few could pull the town back from doing what it had decided to do in the dark. The wagon's wheels had hardly cooled in the ruts when the first man came up the drive with a face someone had tried to iron smooth and failed. He did not knock. He stood on the stoop and looked at Ethan as a man might look at a fence post that needed judgment. "They say the law is wanting," he announced, as if the words themselves could summon a court. "They say a scandal must be cleaned." Ethan felt the cold settle into the joints of his shoulders. He had read men like that in the eyes of horses that had seen storms. This one carried the look of a man who had been paid to carry other men's courage. "We settle with law," Ethan said. His voice was even. There was a weight to it not unlike the weight he shouldered when lifting beams. "No man gets hung at the end of a rumor." The man tilted his chin toward Maine. "Mr. Morrison says the town must do what it can to keep its peace. The people are." "They're afraid of what they don't know," Clara cut in, standing in the kitchen doorway with Sophie at her hip. The ledger was in her hand. She had folded a sheaf of signatures into the inside cover of her satchel. "Fear is a poor counsel.
If your town wants peace, send for the marshal and sit and hear the truth." The visitor blinked as if the word marshal were a foreign coin. "There's no time for that." "No time for law is the same as time for men to do what they please," Clara said. There was a steadiness in her that had nothing to do with being from Boston and everything to do with being a woman who had learned how rumors could run like cracks through a house. He left with his eyes narrowed. Within an hour, the answer to his walk had taken the shape of a rumor bigger than him. Men gathered first at the saloon, then at the post, and then in the spaces between church and shop where talk had power because it traveled in stairs. Harold Morrison moved like a man who would have a chorus for whatever tune he chose. He held conversations behind a hand of the bank's ledger, and where his voice went cold, the town's talk bent into knots. Ethan did not wait for the talk to become rope. He rode out in the mornings, inspecting fences, speaking with Molly and Tom, listening for the names of men who had been persuaded. He came back with faces that told him little beyond the fact that fear finds a husband whose name will take its place easily. The mare breathed in the cold and stamped snow from her fedlocks.
Sophie trailed after him with a small shawl on her shoulders and a look that had the plain courage of the young, not yet carved by the thin expectations of towns. Then, on a lane that cut the prairie toward the canyon where the river took a bad turn over sharp rock, the world slipped into something less tidy. Ethan had gone to call on a neighbor who remembered a promissory note. He was riding a quiet horse, the reins looped in one hand, the ledger in a satchel. The sky had the kind of silver that makes breath into a visible thing, and a flock of ravens had taken to the wire as if they were witnesses. A shout broke the morning. 2 figures stepped out from the lee of a boulder and had aimed in a way that spoke less of hunting and more of intent. The first shot took Ethan's horse in the shoulder. The horse bolted, the saddle slipped, and a breath left the animal like a small deflation. Ethan felt heat bloom in his thigh and knew then the steady certainty of pain that would not be cured by distance. He fell, the world whipping past in the smell of dust and blood and the sting of shock. The men rode away with a shout, a hard, mechanical noise like a hinge closing. They left Ethan with his boots filled tight with clay and the taste of iron in his mouth. He crawled to the shadow cast by a sun-bleached boulder and gripped at the wound that had laced through muscle. The ledger had spilled, ink staining a palm that would soon be less steady. If any wound reveals the measure of a household, it is the one that brings the woman who tends not only to linens, but to lives. Clara found him by the time shadows had shrunk the canyon. Sophie had run ahead to fetch help. Molly and Tom came with bandages. Ethan's shirt was dark with blood where the bullet had torn, and the cold had begun to take him into its quiet. He looked up and saw Clara's face above him, and for a moment the canyon held its breath. "You should have stayed," she said, but she had a needle, and she had a hand that knew where to press and when. The midwife and Molly and Tom did what they could to lift and hold him, while Clara sat, with practiced fingers and a mind sharpened by Boston training and the memory of her father's steadier hands, to the work of cleaning and closing a wound that would otherwise take the man away from them. She used boiled water, the edge of a spoon warmed over coals, a strip of lint folded with laudanum to dull sensations so that the stitches would not tear. She had no surgical theater. She had a pot on the stove and a lamp, and a knowledge that sutures are patience made manifest. When she spoke, her instructions were calm and precise. "Breathe for me, Ethan. Count with me." He did, because men count things that keep them connected. The stitches took. He felt his breath come back like fish to water in small, sputtering gulps. He lost more blood than a man should, but he did not lose himself. They wrapped him, and Tom set a pack of herbs by the bedside, comfrey for binding, yarrow for stopping the flow, and Clara mixed poultices with a hand that refused to tremble. He slept after hours of pain, and the house hummed with low voices of concern. In the night, Clara fed him broth and kept her hand on his forehead. "You cursed and threw things when you were young," she murmured, not to chide, but because it had been a part of how she had come to know him. He smiled without showing teeth, and that smile was a recognition that went beyond gratitude, a thing like the first small bloom after a harsh winter. When word of the ambush reached town, it traveled like a dog with a scent. Some said it was an accident. Others saw in it the shape of men hired to scare. Harold Morrison, for his part, made no public pronouncement beyond a bland inquiry about the safety of travelers. But men in the saloon who had once laughed at the expense of others found their laughter a hollow thing. The ambush made some reconsider the melody to which they had been listening. It was at this point, when blood had been spilled and stitches had been set, that Clara stepped into the space she had waited for. She took the ledger Sam had helped her to translate and began to prepare testimony in a way that required more than signatures. It required faces to be named and memories to be laid down as facts. She rode to the farms that had been bullied into quiet, to the women who had accepted a lesser life because a bank made it hard to be anything else. She coaxed reticence out like a shape out of the fog. She offered no promises beyond the solemnity of the law. Write what you remember, she asked. Write what he made you sign. Don't say what he told you in private. Say what's on paper. Say what you know as if the paper itself were your witness. Men who had been cowed by ledgers found new breath when they found a hand that would hold their story without shame. An old farmer confessed he had signed over a pasture that should have been his. A woman declared she had been told to pay fees that never reached a ledger. Each testimony was a brick in the slow wall they were raising against a man who had used the town's smallness as a sieve to catch the weak. News traveled unevenly. To those who stood to lose by truth, the very act of truth-telling was a danger. Morrison met each affidavit with a varnish of surprise and legalese. He wrote letters and delivered them with a face that betrayed nothing. But the ledger was stubborn. Ink would not be persuaded by smooth talk. Signatures on sworn statements, witnessed by men who still kept the habit of being solemn, began to gather like a force that could not be easily dismissed. It would have been possible, perhaps, to let the law run its course and hope it would be enough. But there are nights when men prefer the theater of action to the slow and luminous work of justice.
The whisper of a different child's skin turned into something else entirely. A meeting of men who liked the idea of being judged for cleanliness. Reverend Mills, who had often used his pulpit to polish conventional fears into sermons, found himself in the company of those who wanted an answer that satisfied more than the court could deliver. He used phrases that suggested impurity. He leaned on theology in ways that made minds fold inward. Morrison and his allies found a meeting place at the back of the bank, a room that smelled of bank ink and tobacco, and there they turned fear into plans. They offered to prove that the child was cause for concern, to protect the town, to remove a threat by restoring a kind of order they preferred. The language was careful, the intent was not. They found men willing to carry ropes because they had been told they were men of the town and needed to do something. The night they planned to bring the town out, the moon was a faded coin sliced into thinness. Torches were readied because torches make a thing look like a crisis. Men who had once chewed tobacco and told idle boasts dressed their hands in a resolve they had practiced only by rumor. Children were padded to the back of the houses while fathers found excuses to be out on the street. For those who wished to do right, there was little time to prepare beyond a call and a steadying of the heart. Ethan had not believed a rope would be needed. He had kept his gun by the stove, not as a toy for breaking things, but as a tool for keeping wolves and other dangers at bay. The night the torches came, he went out because a man must show where his burden falls. He moved like someone who had been used to steadiness. He put himself between the ring of light on Main and the woman his house had taken into it. He did not shout. He had learned that shouting could make men stupid and the dangerous clever. When he shouldered the gun, it was not a flourish. It was a saying of first things. He set it across the crook of his shoulder and let it be seen, and already the crowd's geometry changed. Men who had been loud became lower, not because of the metal but because something else had been revealed, a man willing to stand between a family and the mob. He did not raise the barrel. That would have escalated things to a place the evening could not dare. He only made plain the boundary they could not cross without changing the measure of their lives. The crowd shifted in that old, terrible way. There were men who would have gone on if the gun had not sat like a statue of consequence. There were others who looked at the child in Clara's arms and saw a person rather than a token. Sophie stood at Clara's side, small and brave, and held out a hand as if that simple gesture could do what law sometimes cannot: remind men of the human weight of what they were about to do. Reverend Mills tried to shape a sermon on the spot, but his voice bent.
Judge Bradley shuffled in his robe of authority and tried to wrap the law around his hands like a blanket. Harold Morrison watched and measured every tremor as if the town's fear were his ledger to balance. He had misread something in the arc of the evening. He had convinced himself that the town's appetite would not be curbed by the sight of a man who, by his own admission and by his horses and his plow, knew how to be a man of the valley. Ethan's stillness turned the crowd's appetite into a question. What would they be when the fire went out? On the edge of the square, a figure rode hard and with the particular hurried grace of law. It was Sam Fletcher, hat pressed low, his coat covered in dust from miles of road. Behind him, an official in the uniform of the territorial marshal, badge gleaming like the honesty of a coin, stood with a warrant in hand and a seriousness that had been earned in towns where men had used power as if it were currency. Sam had the look of one who had read the paperwork and found in the ink what he had been told, malfeasance, perjury, and evidence enough to cause the hand of the law to move. The sight of the marshal slowed things further. There is a peculiar humility in the legal badge. It is not an instrument of vengeance, but a tool to apply reason where fury would otherwise have hold. Sam stepped into the ring of torches and laid a stack of papers on the cold planks of Maine. He read names aloud, names of creditors, names of those who had been bilked. He spoke of a promissory note in Harold Morrison's hand, signed where a clerk should have signed. He read affidavits where men had declared under oath the truth of what had been done to them. With each name, the torchlight made the ink look like a bright truth. Morrison scoffed, losing for a moment the composure he cultivated in bank offices. "Paper can be arranged," he said, and there was a flitter of panic behind his smile. "We all need to keep—" "You arranged my ledger so my land could be taken," a voice called from the crowd, one of the men who had at last found courage to speak. "You sold us our own property and called it interest." The marshal listened. He had a warrant for Morrison on charges of fraud, arson, and conspiracy to commit violence. The paper was not a whim. It was sworn proof that the man had engineered a scheme that reached into the town's coffers and into the hearts of men who had been coaxed into wrongdoing. There was no delight in the paperwork. There was only the dull satisfaction of a system doing the work it was designed to do. Harold Morrison's face, which had always been the color of registry ink, went gray. Judge Bradley, who had sat on benches and weighed situations into decisions for years, stepped forward. He did not move as a man of moral righteousness, but as a man whose job was to ensure order. He read the charges, and then, despite everything, did the one thing that would matter. He called for men to lay down their ropes.
Ropes had been brought to town because fear makes men tactile. Sometimes a rope is a symbol you can touch and therefore believe. Men let them lie at their feet, ashamed by the look on their neighbors' faces and by the hand of law that shook no one and took no pleasure in the catching. The marshal made 2 arrests that night, men who had been seen stirring the crowd and the man who had provided the plan. There were more names on a list that would become subpoenas in time. The marshal did not make a show of triumph. He read the charges in a voice even and dry, and then led the accused away in the sober business of consequences. But law does not always march in a clean line. There are people who will run, and there are people who will hide, and there are men who will be taken, and others who will buy themselves into silence for a while. Morrison, like any man with a taste for power, attempted to weather the immediate storm by promising corrections where correction would favor him. He offered to resign some office here and there. He offered compensation he could not in truth pay. Sam Fletcher, who had seen men like Morrison rearrange apologies into instruments of evasion, would have none of it. "We either have the restitution the papers demand," he said, "or we have a court that will hear the truth. You cannot buy the law with a promise when the ledger shows not promise but theft." The trial, if trial is the word for what came to pass, was not a circus of speeches and grandstanding. It was, in the end, a long, careful folding of facts. Affidavits were read in rooms that smelled of chalk and coffee. Witnesses took chairs on a bench and spoke one by one. Clara sat in the corner with Sophie on her lap. She did not speak unless called, and when she did, it was with a voice like dry earth, firm, necessary, without show. She delivered the ledgers to the clerk and gave testimony that would be repeated in depositions and printed in court records. She explained how payments had been shifted, how promissory notes had been altered, and how a man in a bank office had made fortunes off the silence of those who could not read the ink. Ethan, when called, spoke of indignity and fear and the simple acts of a man trying to keep his home. He described the ambush in the canyon. He described the way his family had felt the rope being braided around them. He did not use words meant to inflame. He used words meant to instruct the law toward the facts. The jury, such as it was in a small town where everyone knew something about everyone, listened.
Some were men who had been bribed by the promise of tidy fortune. Others were new to the town's power and felt their consciences stir at the weight of the ledger. A judge from the territorial court sat in when it was clear the local magistracy had been compromised, and he took up the law as a thing that could be neutral if applied with steadiness.
Morrison's defense was a man's reflex. Obfuscation, accusation, the usual circularity of a man who had built himself on doubt. He called witnesses whose faces were set and whose loyalties were plainly paid for. But each lie met another ledger. Where there had been darkness, there was now light enough for ink to be read. The papers matched witness after witness. The marshal had brought other charges, arson in the case of the barn, for which Providence was a thin excuse. The ambush was investigated. Men whose names had been whispered were subpoenaed and arraigned. It was not clean, law seldom is, but it was work that cut away at the rot. There was a day when the town gathered not in the fever of torches, but in the slow, obedient hush of a courtroom, and the scale of truth tipped. The judge read the verdicts, guilty on several counts, and Harold Morrison folded like something that had been held too long under a stern light. The law did its work in sentencing and in the will to make restitution where restitution could be made. The marshal ensured that property records were corrected, that liens were removed, that men who had been bought would have the opportunity to return what they had taken. It did not make whole all that had been bruised by years of greed. A ledger cannot return the years stolen from a family, but it set for them a measure of justice that would be a beginning. After the verdicts and arrests, there came a slow uncoiling in town. Not every face turned bright. There were men who would brood, and neighborhoods where a neighbor's handshake would come awkward at the start. But people like Molly O'Brien found small courage to do larger acts. She walked into the square carrying a stack of quilts she had sewn with her own hands and offered them to the families who had lost storehouses and to the child who had been the cause of all this. "We take care of our own," she said, as if it were the simplest law in the world. Old grudges did not evaporate, but they were for a time softened by the hands that delivered bread and by the neighbors who came to repair what had been broken. Sophie, who had become the small heart of the house, found that some children in town no longer crossed the street when she passed. A girl who had once been distant sat on the steps and watched Clara teach Sophie to stitch initials into a handkerchief. The little gestures of reconciliation are the things that write a village back into being. One farmer who had been cowed by ledgers came and mended Ethan's fence without fanfare, and in doing so, mended a good deal more than wood. Harold Morrison did not go quietly into a private exile of remorse. Men like him find loopholes and lesser convictions to spend their days parsing. His pride had been taken, and he had to learn what humility cost. He paid fines, served time where the law required it, and had his name erased from records that once had bent to his will.
Judge Bradley and Reverend Mills faced inquiries into their part in the social constructions that had allowed suspicion to become ordinance. Some lost office, others offered apologies that were sincere only in how they were practiced afterward. The community's wounds were many, but the law had done its part to force the beginning of repair. What the law did not stitch together alone, the people began to do among themselves. Dinners were shared without ceremony. Men who had stood at torches now lit lanterns. Fathers watched differently as their children played near the double W. Clara, for her part, did not rest on the laurels of victory. She kept the little ledger at her bedside and wrote in it the names of those who might yet need help. She taught a woman in town how to keep her own accounts and how to read a promissory note. She turned her knowledge into a kind of teaching that would last beyond any single verdict. Ethan, who had once been a man content to measure his life in fence posts and horses, found something else nesting in the long afternoons. He began to speak to Clara not as the woman who had been placed in his house through the uneasy labor of bank ledgers, but as someone he had chosen to be with. There was an ease now when they passed each other in the kitchen that had not been there in their first months. He would sit on the stoop while Clara mended, and he would talk about the past in ways that had the edge rubbed out of them. Sophie, who had been a child of suspicion, grew into one of quiet joy. She would braid the child's hair and hum while the animals shifted in their pens. Children are small catechisms of hope. The first months after the trial, the baby grew, not into a symbol, but into a person who would one day be a neighbor or a friend. People watched the child in time and saw there was no moral taint to the flesh. There was only the ordinary progress of eating and sleeping and toddling.
A woman who had once signed dead papers under Morrison's presidents came by and left a basket of preserves with Clara. She said nothing of shame. She simply asked if Clara would teach her to read the bank's notices so she would not be taken again. There were incremental, imperfect reconciliations. The church organized an evening where stories of kindness were told in equal measure with apologies. Judge Bradley offered to help in the registry office and to attend training on how to ensure justice be blind to the whims of the powerful. Reverend Mills, who had learned the sharp lesson of a sermon used as a weapon, spoke in later Sundays of humility. He read texts that called for kindness and the care of the other. Words do little alone, but when matched with action, they mean the steady, dutiful mending of a town. Time settled, as it does, into an ordinary rhythm. The Double W's roof needed repairs, and they were men who did the labor without charge.
The barn's charred beams were replaced with timber from a neighbor's lot, and children painted the fence in broad, messy strokes that made everyone smile. Clara, who had once kept lavender to remember the city, now grew herbs by the kitchen step that Sophie would fetch in small bunches. She kept a small box of the bank's old receipts, not as trophies, but as reminders of the work a community must do to keep predatory things at bay. There was no miraculous transformation overnight. The town did not become saintly because one man had been punished. Prejudice slumbers in places where understanding does not take root. But there were changes that mattered. A law clerk who refused bribes in the future, a teacher who began to include lessons about property rights, children who learned to play without turning a neighbor into a cartoon of fear. The lives of people are not turned by a single verdict, but by 100 small acts thereafter. On a late summer evening, when the air smelled of warm dust and cut hay, the family sat on the porch. The sun folded itself behind the hills and spread a softness over the fields that made every small thing look kind. Sophie rocked the child in a low chair. Ethan had his boots off and his hands behind his head. Clara passed plates of sweet cake and watched the day's light travel across faces that had been braided together by hardship and a shared willingness to do better. The porch held the sounds of cicadas and a dog that slept with the contentment of a being who had earned its place. Clara's hand found Ethan's, and they held it as people do when the world has taught them the reciprocal nature of care. She thought of Boston and of her father, not as a wound that had to be reopened, but as a map of the woman she had become by making new choices. She thought of the ledger under her pillow, still with pages she had not yet filed away, and she smiled with a small, private knowledge. The work had not ended. Justice is an endless tending. So must be love. Sophie looked up and caught a firefly that had wandered too close and let it go with a laugh. Ethan watched his daughter and the children who played across the yard and felt the softness of something in him that the hard years had once stolen. He had gone to the Ring of Torches thinking he might be the last defender of something small and private. Instead, he had found a life that kept growing because he chose, each day, to stand beside what he loved. The town would remember the Night of Torches for years. Some told it as a cautionary tale, others as proof one man could dissuade many. But for Clara and Ethan it became a hinge, the moment when a forced marriage, birthed from coercion and ledger, became the place where choice and love and stubborn work took root. The child who had once been the center of rumor was now a small hand that reached for cheeks with the same reckless confidence children have when they are loved.
Clara would still sit at the desk by lamplight and write. She taught neighbors to read the fine print of contracts and taught Sophie to keep accounts with a steady hand. She had been mocked once for the idea of usefulness in a frontier where muscle was worshipped, and now she had proof that the skill of knowing is itself muscle. There were nights after the children had fallen asleep when Ethan and Clara would sit and talk of how thin a line it had been between being torn apart and being made whole. They did not pretend the town was a different place in its deepest parts. Prejudice has roots that need longer to be unearthed. But they had taken a stand. They had drawn a boundary no one in that town would cross without consequence. They had shown, in a way the law alone could not, that families are not always formed by contract and circumstance. Sometimes they are forged by choice and by the steady insistence that another person's life is not to be bartered. Years would bring more trials, medical ailments, seasonal drought, neighborly spats, but they would also bring harvests and birthdays and the small invariants of ordinary life. The children would grow and learn to read ledgers and to mend fences. The law, once called in the dark, became a thing the town used to protect its weak and its honest,
rather than the tool of those in easy chairs. That was the slow promise they had earned. When the narrator looks back on that night of torches, he sees it as a sliver in a larger tapestry. It is dramatic because men love drama, but what matters is the day-by-day refusal to let fear be the architect of life. Ethan loading his gun under the torches bought a measure of time. Clara's ink bought them the rest. The marshal's badge bought a formal correction of wrongs, and the people's small acts bought the future where a child could run without the shadow of a past rumor hanging heavy. If the story offers anything like a lesson, it is this. Power can be misused, and fear can be coaxed into cruelty, but law, when wielded with patience and courage, can right many things. The resting work of kindness and the steady hand of those who refuse to yield their neighbors to rumor complete the work of courts. A family that was once an obligation becomes, by choice and by insistence, and by the daily habit of looking after each other, a home. On the porch, with the light dying gold around them, Clara folded another stitch into a quilt. Sophie hummed a tune she had learned from Molly. Ethan watched the valley and saw the tracks of horses that would soon carry goods and gossip in equal measure. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a man who had done what was necessary and found in the doing more of himself. If you believe a family may be made by choice and courage, share this tale with someone you think needs that reminder.